gates of Blackridge Fortress slammed shut behind Elena Voss before she even understood what was happening to her life. One moment, she had been walking home from her late shift at the diner on the edge of town, and the next, hands she could not see had pulled her through a wall of trees that should not have existed on that street. She had fought, she had screamed, until her throat burned raw. None of it mattered. The forest had swallowed her whole, and now she stood in a stone courtyard, surrounded by men and women, whose eyes glowed faintly gold in the dark, watching her the way hunters watch something that has wandered into a trap. "Bring her inside," a voice said. It was calm, low, and carried more authority than any voice Elena had ever heard. "The king will decide what to do with her." Elena's heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She had heard stories. The kind parents told children to keep them from wandering into the woods at night. Wolves that walked like men. A kingdom hidden behind the tree line, ruled by a man they called the Alpha King. She had always believed they were just stories. She did not believe that anymore. 2 guards gripped her arms and marched her through corridors carved from black stone, lit by torches that flickered without smoke. Elena tried to memorize the turns, some instinct in her insisting that if she could just remember the way out, she could survive this. But the fortress twisted and folded in on itself, like something built by a mind that did not think the way humans did, and soon she had no idea which direction led back to the world she knew. They stopped in front of 2 massive doors, black wood banded with iron, taller than any door had a right to be. The guards did not knock. They simply pushed the doors open and shoved her forward into the room beyond. The chamber was vast, lit by a fire that roared in a hearth large enough to stand inside, and at the far end, seated in a chair that was not quite a throne, but was not quite anything else either, sat a man who made every hair on Elena's body rise. He did not look like a king. He looked like something that had been carved from winter, and given a heartbeat only reluctantly. His hair was dark, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes, when they lifted to meet hers, were a shade of amber so pale, they seemed to glow from the inside. He wore no crown. He did not need one. Every line of his body said that he owned this room, this fortress, and everyone breathing inside it. "Your Majesty," one of the guards said, bowing low. "We found her near the eastern border, during the skirmish with the Thornwood pack. She is human." The king's gaze did not move from Elena's face. "I can see that." His voice slid over her skin like something physical, and Elena felt her knees weaken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She hated that reaction immediately. She did not know this man. She did not know this place. And yet something in her chest had gone strangely, dangerously quiet the second his eyes found hers, as if her own heartbeat had decided to match itself to his. "What is your name?" the king asked. Elena lifted her chin, refusing to let her voice shake, even though every part of her wanted to. "Elena Voss. And you wandered into wolf territory during an active conflict, Elena Voss. It was not a question. That is either very brave or very foolish." "I didn't wander anywhere," she snapped, anger finally breaking through the fear. "I was walking home. Something pulled me through the trees. I didn't ask to be here." A murmur rippled through the guards at her tone. No one, it seemed, spoke to the king that way. But he did not react with the fury Elena expected. Instead, something flickered behind his amber eyes, something that looked almost like surprise. And then, for the first time in longer than anyone in that room could remember, the low, restless growl that always lived beneath the king's skin, the sound only those closest to him could sense, the constant simmer of the wolf trapped inside him, went silent. Damien Ashford felt it happen before he understood it. One breath, his wolf had been pacing the edges of his mind the way it always did, agitated, hungry for control, barely leashed since the death of his father 3 years ago. The next breath, it had gone still, quiet. Calm in a way it had not been since he was a boy, who still believed the world was safe. He straightened in his seat, unsettled by the sudden peace inside him, and he did not understand why it had happened the moment this human woman spoke. "Leave us," he said. The guards hesitated. "Your Majesty, she is a stranger, and the Thornwood pack." "I said leave us." His voice cracked like a whip, and this time the wolf's stillness did not break, which surprised him even more. Normally any flash of command sent tremors through his control. Not now. The guards bowed and retreated, closing the great doors behind them, leaving Elena alone in the firelit chamber with a man who ruled over creatures she had, until an hour ago, believed were myths. "Sit," the king said, gesturing to a chair near the hearth. "I'd rather stand." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You are either very brave, Elena Voss, or you have not yet understood how much danger you are in." "Maybe both," she said, though her voice trembled slightly on the last word. He studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the strange, unsettling sensation of being read like a book she had not agreed to open. His eyes moved over her face, not with hunger, not the way men sometimes looked at her on the street, but with something closer to confusion, as if she were a puzzle whose pieces did not match the picture on the box. "What did you do to me?" he asked quietly. Elena blinked. "What?" "Just now, when you spoke." He rose from his seat, and even that simple movement carried a weight that made the air in the room feel heavier. "Something in me went quiet." "It has not been quiet in a very long time." "I didn't do anything," Elena said, taking an involuntary step back as he came closer. "I don't even know what you are talking about." "No," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I don't suppose you would." He circled her slowly, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, close enough that she could see the way his jaw tightened as if he were fighting some instinct she could not see. Elena forced herself to hold still, though every nerve in her body screamed at her to run. "Your name," he said again. "Say it again." "Elena Voss," she said, frustration cutting through her fear. "Why does that matter?" The moment the words left her mouth, she saw it happen. His shoulders, which had been drawn tight since the moment she entered the room, eased. Just slightly, just enough that she noticed. His breathing slowed, and something in his amber eyes softened in a way that looked almost like relief, quickly hidden behind a mask of composure. "It matters," he said, "because I have not slept a full night in 3 years. Because the wolf inside me has clawed at the walls of my own mind since the day I took this crown, and no healer, no seer, no ritual has ever quieted it. And you, a human woman who fell into my territory by accident, silence it simply by speaking." Elena did not know what to say to that. She had come here terrified, certain she was about to become some kind of prisoner or worse, and now this powerful, dangerous man was looking at her as though she held the answer to a question that had haunted him for years. "I don't understand any of this," she admitted. "Wolves, kings, none of it is real where I come from." "It is real enough now," Damien said, "and I intend to find out why my wolf has chosen to kneel for you." "I'm not staying here," Elena said quickly. "Whatever this is, whatever I did, I have a life. A job. People who will notice I'm gone." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something colder returning to his eyes. "No one crosses into wolf territory and simply walks back out, Elena Voss. Not when the border is at war. Not when my own instincts are telling me you are more important than you realize. So I'm a prisoner." "You are a guest," he said, though the words sounded sharpened at the edges. "Until I understand what is happening. After that, we will discuss your freedom." Elena's fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to argue, to demand he let her go immediately, but something about the absolute certainty in his voice told her it would be useless. He was not a man who could be argued out of a decision once he had made it. "Fine," she said instead, forcing steel into her voice she did not entirely feel. "But I want answers, about what I am to you, about why any of this is happening." "You will have them," Damien said. "In time." He turned toward the door and called for the guards to return, and as they entered, Elena caught the way his eyes lingered on her one more moment before he composed himself into the cold, commanding king the rest of the room expected to see. "Take her to the east wing," he ordered. "The chambers near mine. See that she is comfortable. She is not to be harmed, and she is not to be treated as a prisoner." The lead guard's eyebrows rose slightly before he caught himself. "Yes, Your Majesty." As they led her from the room, Elena glanced back once. Damien Ashford stood by the fire, watching her go, his expression unreadable, his posture as rigid and controlled as it had been from the moment she entered. But she noticed the way his hand had curled slightly at his side, as if he were resisting the urge to reach for her, to keep whatever strange peace she had brought him from slipping away the second she left the room. She did not understand what was happening to her. She did not understand this world of wolves and kings and silent, ancient instincts. But as the guards led her deeper into the fortress, past torches and stone archways, and eyes that watched her with open curiosity from every shadow, Elena understood one thing clearly. Whatever had pulled her through those trees, whatever force had dragged her out of her ordinary life and into this place of danger and myth, it had not been an accident. And somewhere behind her, in a chamber lit by firelight, the Alpha King, who had not known peace in 3 years, stood very still, listening to the silence inside himself, and wondering how he was ever going to let her go. The East Wing chambers were nothing like Elena expected a prison to look like. The room they brought her to was warm, lined with tapestries in deep reds and golds, with a bed large enough to fit 4 people, and windows that looked out over a moonlit forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. A fire already burned in the hearth, and a tray of food sat untouched on a table near the window, as if someone had known she would arrive hungry and frightened and unwilling to ask for anything. She did not eat. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed, arms wrapped around herself, and tried to make sense of a night that had turned her entire understanding of the world upside down. Wolves that walked like men, a king whose animal instincts bent to the sound of her voice, a fortress hidden behind trees that should not exist. None of it made sense, and yet here she was, breathing the smoke of a fire that crackled too quietly, staring at a door she had no doubt was guarded on the other side. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Before she could answer, the door opened, and a young woman stepped inside carrying folded linens. She had warm brown skin, dark curling hair pulled back from her face, and eyes that studied Elena with open curiosity, rather than the wary suspicion the guards had shown. "I'm Grace," the woman said, setting the linens on a chair. "I was told to see if you needed anything." "I need to go home," Elena said, though she already suspected what the answer would be. Grace's expression softened with something like sympathy. "I know this is frightening. Believe me, I understand better than you think. I wasn't born in this world either." That caught Elena's attention. "You're human?" "I was," Grace said. "Now I'm mated to one of the king's guards, which makes me pack, even if I never grew fur of my own." She smiled faintly, though there was something guarded behind it. "It's not the life I expected. But it isn't the nightmare you're probably imagining either." "Everyone in that hall looked at me like I was a threat," Elena said, "or a curiosity, like I was something to be studied." "You are," Grace admitted, lowering her voice as she moved closer. "Do you know what happened tonight? In the throne room?" Elena shook her head slowly. "Not really." "The king's wolf has been unstable since his father died," Grace said. "Everyone in the fortress knows it, even if no one says it aloud. He barely sleeps. His temper has grown shorter every season. There have been nights the guards feared he might lose control entirely." She glanced toward the door, as if checking that no one listened. "And then you walked into that room, and for the first time in 3 years, he looked calm." Elena's stomach twisted. "That doesn't mean anything. I don't even know him." "Maybe not," Grace said. "But in our world, that kind of connection is not something anyone ignores, least of all a king whose stability holds an entire kingdom together." She hesitated, then added quietly, "Be careful, Elena, not because he means you harm. I don't think he does, but because what you are to him, whatever it turns out to be, is not a small thing, and not everyone in this fortress will be happy about it." Before Elena could ask what she meant, Grace excused herself, promising to return in the morning, and left Elena alone once more with the fire, the silence, and the impossible weight of everything she had just learned. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window and watched the forest, wondering how many miles of trees stood between her and the life she used to have, and wondering, with a fear she did not want to examine too closely, whether some part of her already understood that she was never going to look at that life the same way again. Far across the fortress, in a chamber even larger and colder than the one they had given her, Damien Ashford sat awake as well, staring into his own fire, feeling something he had almost forgotten how to feel: quiet. For 3 years, the wolf inside him had never stopped moving, never stopped clawing, a storm he carried in his own skin that no one else could see. Tonight, for the first time, It slept, and he did not know whether to be grateful or terrified of what that meant. He thought of her voice. Elena Voss, a name that should have meant nothing to him, a woman who should have been nothing more than an unfortunate stranger, caught on the wrong side of a border skirmish. And yet his wolf had gone still the moment she spoke, as if some ancient, buried part of him had been waiting 3 long years for exactly that sound. Damien did not believe in accidents. He had ruled long enough, fought enough wars, buried enough of his own people, to know that the universe rarely handed a man anything without demanding a price in return. Whatever Elena Voss was to him, whatever strange power let her soothe a wolf that had answered to no one, it was not going to be simple. But sitting there in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sound of his own silence, Damien found he could not bring himself to regret the night the border war had pulled a human woman into his world. He only wondered how long he would be allowed to keep her. Morning came with a knock that Elena almost did not hear over the sound of her own restless thoughts. She had drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep sometime before dawn, and when Grace entered carrying a simple dress of soft gray fabric, Elena sat up quickly, disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. Then the memory of the night before crashed back over her, and her stomach tightened all over again. "The king wants to see you," Grace said, setting the dress on the end of the bed. "He asked that you join him for breakfast. Is that a request or an order?" Elena asked, swinging her legs out of bed. Grace's mouth quirked into a small, knowing smile. With him, it's usually both. Elena changed quickly, grateful the dress fit well enough, and followed Grace through corridors that looked less menacing in the pale morning light than they had the night before. Sunlight filtered through high windows, catching on dust motes, and warming the black stone until it did not seem quite as cold. Servants and guards passed them in the halls, and every single one of them turned to stare, some with curiosity, some with something closer to suspicion. "They're not used to strangers," Grace murmured, noticing Elena's discomfort. "Especially not human ones, the king insists on treating well." They arrived at a smaller room than the throne chamber, one with a long table, set with more food than Elena had ever seen in one place, and there, at the head of the table, sat Damien. He looked different in daylight, less like a myth carved from winter, more like a man, though an undeniably striking one, his dark hair slightly less severe, his jaw shadowed with the beginning of stubble he had not yet shaved away. His eyes still carried that pale amber intensity, but when they landed on Elena, something in his shoulders loosened, the same way it had the night before. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. It was, Elena noted, not the chair furthest away, but the one closest. She sat, and Grace slipped quietly out of the room, leaving them alone. "I trust you slept," Damien said. "Not really," Elena admitted. "It's hard to sleep in a fortress full of wolves after finding out wolves are real." The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but closer than anything she had seen from him yet. "Fair enough." He gestured for her to eat, and though her stomach was too knotted with nerves to feel much hunger, Elena took a piece of bread if only to have something to do with her hands. The silence stretched between them, not entirely uncomfortable, but heavy with everything neither of them had said yet. "I've been thinking about what happened last night," Damien said finally. "I want to understand it. Not because I intend to use you for it," he added quickly, when Elena's eyes narrowed, "but because whatever this connection is, it matters, not just to me, to the stability of this kingdom." "How can one person calming your temper matter to an entire kingdom?" Elena asked. Damien set down the cup he had been holding. "You misunderstand what my wolf is. It is not simply temper. It is instinct, power, the animal half of what makes me capable of leading this pack. When an alpha's wolf grows unstable, the pack feels it. Decisions grow harsher. Judgment grows clouded. Wars are started that should never have begun." His jaw tightened. "My father's death fractured something in me that no healer has been able to mend. 3 years of restlessness, of barely controlled fury, of nights I did not trust myself to be near anyone I cared for. And then you spoke, and it simply stopped." Elena absorbed that, feeling the weight of it settle uncomfortably in her chest. "I don't know how to be responsible for something like that." "I'm not asking you to be responsible for it," Damien said. "I'm asking you to stay long enough for us to understand it, There are elders here, seers who study bonds older than either of us. I want to consult them. After that, if you still wish to leave, I will arrange it myself." It was more than Elena expected him to offer, and something in his tone told her he meant it, however reluctant he seemed to be making the promise. "And until then, you are not a prisoner," he said. "You may walk the fortress grounds. Grace will accompany you, for your safety more than anything else. Not everyone here will be pleased that a human has captured the king's attention so completely, and I would rather you not learn that the hard way." Elena's stomach tightened at the warning, but she nodded. "Fine, I'll stay. For now." Something in Damien's expression eased, though he tried to hide it behind the mask of controlled composure he seemed to wear like armor. "Good," he said simply, and returned to his meal, as if the conversation had not just changed the course of both their lives. They ate in a silence that felt, strangely, less tense than before, occasionally broken by Damien asking small questions about her life outside the fortress. Her job at the diner, the small apartment she rented above a bakery that made the whole building smell like cinnamon in the mornings. He listened with more attention than she expected from a king, his amber eyes fixed on her, as though her ordinary human life were the most interesting story he had heard in years. "You miss it," he observed, when she described the sound of traffic outside her window, a sound she had always complained about, and now found herself aching for. "Of course I miss it," Elena said. "It's my life." "I understand," Damien said quietly, and something in his voice made Elena think he understood loss, in a way that went far deeper than a missed apartment. "I lost the life I expected to have as well, the day my father died, and this crown became mine, before I was ready for it." For a moment, the wall between them, king and stranger, thinned just enough for Elena to see the exhaustion beneath his composure, the years of carrying a kingdom's weight on shoulders too young to have inherited it. She almost reached across the table before catching herself, unsettled by how naturally the instinct had risen in her. The moment was broken by the doors opening sharply, and a tall man with sharp features and dark, watchful eyes strode in, without waiting to be announced. He stopped short at the sight of Elena, his expression hardening instantly. "Marcus," Damien said, his tone shifting into something cooler, more formal. "You could have knocked." "I heard rumors," Marcus said, ignoring the rebuke, his eyes fixed on Elena with open suspicion. "That the king dined with a human this morning. I did not believe them until now." "Elena is a guest," Damien said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "Guard your tone." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head slightly, though the distrust in his eyes did not fade. "Forgive me, Your Majesty, but surely you understand the concern. A human, appearing during an active conflict with Thornwood, somehow finding her way straight into your personal quarters." His gaze flicked to Elena. "It is not paranoia to question such convenient timing." "I did not choose to be here," Elena said sharply, refusing to let his accusation sit unanswered. "I was pulled through the trees against my will. If you have questions about how I ended up here, I'd like the answers myself." Something flickered in Marcus's expression, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect, though it did not soften the wariness in his gaze. "We shall see," he said simply, before turning back to Damien. "The elders have gathered as you requested. They are ready to examine the situation whenever you are prepared." "We will come now," Damien said, rising from his seat. As Marcus left the room, Elena caught the way his eyes lingered on her one last time, unreadable, calculating, and she understood, with a chill that settled deep in her chest, that not everyone in this fortress would be as willing as Damien to give her the benefit of the doubt. "Don't mind Marcus," Damien said as he led her from the room, his voice quieter now that they were alone in the corridor. "He has been my beta since we were boys. His loyalty makes him suspicious of anything he does not understand, and right now, that includes you." "He's not wrong to be suspicious," Elena admitted. "None of this makes sense to me either." "Perhaps the elders will help with that," Damien said, though something in his tone suggested he was not entirely certain he wanted the answer they might give. They walked together through corridors that grew progressively older, the black stone giving way to walls carved with symbols Elena did not recognize, ancient and worn smooth by centuries of hands. She found herself very aware of how close Damien walked beside her, close enough that his shoulder occasionally brushed hers, and she told herself the warmth that spread through her at the contact meant nothing at all. She was still telling herself that when they reached the Elder's chamber, and the true weight of what she had become to this fortress, and to its king, was about to be revealed. The Elder's chamber was unlike any room Elena had seen in the fortress so far. Instead of black stone and iron torches, the walls here were lined with shelves of old books, dried herbs hanging in bundles from the ceiling, and a fire pit sunk into the center of the floor, its smoke curling upward through a hole in the stone ceiling toward the morning sky. 3 elders sat around the fire, 2 men and a woman whose white hair was woven with small bones and beads that clicked softly when she moved. The woman's eyes, when they landed on Elena, widened slightly before narrowing in sharp focus. "So," she said, her voice raspy with age but carrying an unmistakable authority of its own. "This is the one." "Ruth," Damien said, inclining his head in respect. "Thank you for gathering on short notice." When the king himself requests an audience about a sudden and unexplained calming of his wolf, I do not consider it short notice, Ruth said. I consider it overdue. Her gaze moved back to Elena, studying her with an intensity that made Elena want to shift uncomfortably in place. "Come closer, child. Let me look at you properly." Elena glanced at Damien, who nodded once, and she stepped forward until she stood at the edge of the fire pit, the smoke curling lazily around her ankles. Ruth rose slowly, her joints creaking, and circled Elena the way Damien had the night before, though her gaze felt different, less like being studied, and more like being read, as if the old woman could see something written beneath Elena's skin that no one else could. "There is an old bond," Ruth said finally, settling back onto her cushion by the fire, "older than any of the pack laws written in this fortress, older even than the first Alpha Kings who ruled these lands." She gestured for Damien and Elena to sit, and they did, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Some human souls carry what the old texts call a resonance, a frequency, if you understand the word better that way, that matches the frequency of a wolf's spirit so closely that the two settle into harmony the moment they meet. "A resonance," Elena repeated slowly. "Like some kind of match?" "Something like that," Ruth said. "It is rare. Rarer than a true mate bond, which at least announces itself clearly to both parties from the first meeting. A resonance is quieter, subtler. It does not always come with the burning recognition of fated mates. Sometimes it simply arrives as peace, as calm, as the wolf finally finding the one presence in the world that steadies rather than provokes it." Damien's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the fire rather than on Elena. "And this resonance, is it permanent?" "That depends," Ruth said, "on many things. On whether it is nurtured or ignored. On whether the two souls involved choose to honor what has been placed before them, or whether they fight against it until it withers." Her sharp eyes moved between them. "I have seen resonance bonds save kingdoms, Your Majesty. I have also seen alphas ignore them, cast aside the one soul capable of steadying their wolf, and descend into the kind of instability that ends in war, or worse." The weight of her words settled heavily over the room. Elena felt Damien's gaze return to her, and when she met it, she saw something raw beneath his composed exterior, something that looked almost like fear. "What happens to her?" Damien asked quietly, "if the bond is ignored? If she chooses to leave and return to her own world?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently turning one of the small bones woven into her hair. "The wolf will feel the absence as a wound. It will not kill you, Your Majesty. Not directly. But instability will return, likely worse than before, because the wolf will have known peace and lost it." As for her, Ruth's gaze turned to Elena, softer now, almost pitying. "A resonance is not one-directional, child, even if it does not always announce itself as clearly to the human side. You may find that leaving this place does not feel as simple as walking away once was." Elena's chest tightened at the implication, though she pushed the feeling down, unwilling to examine it too closely, in front of two people already studying her so intently. "I still have a life outside these walls," she said, more to remind herself than anyone else. "A life I didn't choose to leave." "No one is asking you to abandon it," Ruth said gently, "only to understand what you carry, and what choosing to walk away might cost, not just you, but everyone tied to this king's stability." She rose, signaling the conversation had reached its natural end. "Take time, both of you. Bonds like this are rarely simple, and rushing them, in either direction, tends to end poorly." Damien thanked the elders and led Elena from the chamber, back through the ancient corridors, both of them quiet with the weight of what they had learned. Elena's mind spun with questions she did not know how to ask, and beside her, Damien's silence felt heavier than it had that morning, as if Ruth's warning had settled into his shoulders like a physical weight. "You don't have to decide anything today," Damien said finally, as they reached the corridor leading back toward her chambers. "I know this is a great deal to accept in less than a day." "It's a great deal to accept in a lifetime," Elena said, only half joking. Something that might have been a real smile flickered across Damien's face, quick and unguarded, gone almost before she registered it. "I imagine so." They stopped outside her door, and for a moment, neither of them moved to end the conversation, the air between them charged with everything Ruth had said, and everything neither of them had yet found the words to voice. Elena studied his face, searching for the cold, unreadable king she had met the night before, but found instead a man who looked, for just that moment, as uncertain as she felt. "Thank you," she said finally, "for not forcing me to make a decision I'm not ready for." "I told you," Damien said quietly. "You are not a prisoner here. And if I decide to leave, once all of this is settled, will you actually let me go?" His jaw flexed, and for a long moment he did not answer, his amber eyes searching hers, as though the question cost him something to consider. "Yes," he said finally, though the word came out rougher than he probably intended. "I made you a promise. I intend to keep it." Elena nodded, though something in her chest ached unexpectedly at the certainty in his voice, at the idea that he might truly let her walk away without a fight. She told herself that was what she wanted. She told herself that as she said goodnight and closed her door, and she told herself that again, as she lay awake long into the night, thinking not of her apartment above the bakery, or the sound of traffic she used to complain about, but of amber eyes that had gone quiet the moment she spoke his name. Somewhere across the fortress, Damien stood at his window, staring out at the same moonlit forest, wrestling with a truth he had not expected to face so soon. He had promised to let her go if she chose to leave. He intended to keep that promise. He simply did not know, staring into the dark, how he was ever going to survive doing it. Word of the resonance bond spread through Blackridge Fortress faster than Elena could have imagined. By the second morning, she noticed the change immediately. Servants who had merely stared at her with curiosity now lowered their eyes respectfully when she passed, while others watched her with an open suspicion that made her skin prickle. Grace walked beside her everywhere she went, and Elena began to understand that the escort was not simply for guidance through the fortress's confusing halls. "They're saying you've bewitched him," Grace admitted quietly, as they walked through the training yard one afternoon, watching pack warriors spar in the distance. "That you used some human trick to steal his wolf's loyalty." "That's ridiculous," Elena said. "I didn't do anything except exist." "I know that," Grace said. "But fear makes people believe strange things, especially fear about their king's stability. Some of them remember what it was like right after his father died, before his wolf settled into whatever balance it managed to find. They're afraid of losing that balance again, and they don't understand what you are well enough to trust it." Elena watched the warriors spar, their movements fast and precise, wolves in human skin fighting with a controlled ferocity that reminded her, uncomfortably, of exactly how dangerous this world truly was. What happens if they decide I'm a threat instead of a solution? Grace's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. They were interrupted by the arrival of a woman Elena had not met before, tall and striking, with dark red hair braided elegantly down her back, and eyes that studied Elena with open, calculating interest. "So this is her," the woman said, circling Elena much the way Ruth had, though with far less warmth. "The human who has the whole fortress whispering." "Charlotte," Grace said, a note of caution entering her voice. "This is Elena." "I know who she is," Charlotte said, her smile sharp despite its politeness. "Everyone knows who she is." Her gaze swept over Elena, assessing, and something in her expression suggested she did not particularly like what she found, or perhaps simply resented that it existed at all. "I hope you understand what you've stumbled into, human. The Alpha King's stability is not a small matter. If you disrupt it further, intentionally or not, you will find this fortress considerably less welcoming than it has been." "Is that a threat?" Elena asked, refusing to let her voice waver. "It's a warning," Charlotte said. Delivered with far more courtesy than you'll receive from others, I promise you. She turned and walked away without waiting for a response, leaving a tension in the air that took several long moments to fade. Ignore her, Grace said, though her own expression remained troubled. Charlotte comes from one of the oldest families in the pack. She's always believed the king should choose a mate from within pack lines, someone who understands our traditions, our history. She's not going to be your ally, but she's not likely to act against you directly either. Not while the king has made his protection of you so clear. Elena said nothing, but the encounter lingered with her for the rest of the day, a reminder that whatever strange peace she had brought to Damien, she remained an outsider in a world that had not asked for her presence and did not universally welcome it. That evening, Damien found her on the fortress's eastern balcony, watching the sun sink behind the endless trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet that reminded her, with a sudden ache, of sunsets she used to watch from her apartment window. "You seem troubled," he said, joining her at the railing. "Word travels fast here," Elena said. "I've been warned twice today about disrupting your stability." Damien's expression darkened. "Who warned you?" "It doesn't matter," Elena said, though she noted the protective edge that had entered his voice. "I understand their concern, even if it isn't fair. I'm a stranger who appeared out of nowhere and somehow ended up mattering to the most powerful man in this fortress. Of course people are suspicious. Their concern does not give them the right to threaten you," Damien said, his jaw tight. "No one threatened me. Not directly." Elena studied his face in the fading light, the way his composure had cracked just slightly at the idea of someone frightening her. "You care what happens to me." It was not quite a question, but Damien answered it as though it had been. "More than I expected to, given how briefly I have known you." He turned to face her fully, the sunset painting gold across the sharp planes of his face. "I have spent 3 years learning not to trust the quiet in my own mind, Elena. Learning to brace for the moment my control would slip and I would become something my people feared rather than followed. And then you arrived, and for the first time since my father died, I did not have to brace for anything." The honesty in his voice caught Elena off guard, stripped of the cold authority he usually carried like armor. "I don't know what to do with that," she admitted quietly. "I didn't come here looking to matter to anyone. I had a whole life, a plan. Nothing extraordinary, but it was mine." "I'm not asking you to give that up," Damien said. "I told you, I intend to keep my promise. If you choose to leave once the elders complete their study of the bond, I will not stop you." "But you don't want me to leave," Elena said, watching his face carefully. Damien did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the horizon as the last light of the sun disappeared behind the trees. "No," he admitted finally, his voice quieter than she had heard it. "I don't. But wanting something does not give me the right to take it from you." The honesty in his answer settled somewhere deep in Elena's chest, unraveling something she had been trying to keep carefully knotted since the moment she arrived. She thought of Charlotte's warning, of Marcus's suspicion, of the entire weight of a kingdom watching to see what she would do with the strange power she had never asked for. And beneath all of it, she thought of the way Damien's shoulders eased whenever she was near, the quiet he found in her presence that he could not find anywhere else. "I'm not ready to decide anything," she said finally, "but I'm not ready to leave either. Not yet." Something in Damien's expression eased, relief he did not bother hiding this time. "Then we have time," he said. "That is enough, for now." They stood together at the railing as the last colors faded from the sky, neither of them speaking, both of them aware that whatever was growing between them, resonance bond or something neither of them had a name for yet, had already become far more complicated and far more real than either of them had been prepared for. Below them, unseen in the shadows of the courtyard, Marcus watched the balcony with narrowed eyes, already turning over plans he had no intention of sharing with his king, convinced that whatever peace this human woman brought Damien, it would not come without a cost. The whole pack would eventually be forced to pay. The incident that changed everything happened 5 days later, in the Great Hall, during a gathering Elena had not been meant to attend. She had come looking for Grace, following the sound of raised voices down a corridor she had not explored before, and arrived just in time to see the hall filled with pack leaders from across the territory, all of them gathered for what she would later learn was an emergency council regarding the ongoing conflict with the Thornwood pack. At the head of the room, Damien stood rigid, his hands braced against the long table, and even from the doorway, Elena could feel something was deeply wrong. "They burned the northern outpost," a broad-shouldered man was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "6 of our warriors did not make it out. This is no longer a border dispute, Your Majesty. This is war." Elena watched Damien's shoulders tense, watched the muscles in his jaw flex as he absorbed the news, and something in the room shifted, a pressure building that she could feel even without the heightened senses everyone else in that hall possessed. The candles along the walls flickered as though a wind had passed through despite the closed windows, and several of the assembled pack members took an involuntary step back. "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, his voice low with warning. "Your control." Damien's hands, still braced against the table, had begun to shake, faint tremors running through fingers that looked, for one terrifying moment, less like a man's hands and less like anything human at all. His eyes, when he lifted them, had shifted, the amber bleeding brighter, wilder, the calm control he usually wore slipping visibly away in front of the entire assembled council. Elena did not think, she simply moved. She crossed the hall before anyone could stop her, ignoring the startled murmurs and the way several warriors instinctively reached for weapons at her sudden approach, and she did not stop until she stood directly beside Damien, close enough to place her hand over his where it gripped the edge of the table. "Damien," she said quietly, using his name rather than his title for the first time in front of witnesses. "Look at me." The hall went utterly silent, every eye fixed on the two of them, on the human woman who had just laid her hand over the trembling fist of an alpha king, on the verge of losing control in front of his entire council. Elena felt the danger of the moment acutely, felt the weight of dozens of predatory eyes watching to see what would happen, but she did not look away from Damien's face. Slowly, his eyes found hers, wild and amber, and struggling against something that wanted desperately to break free. "Elena," he said, her name coming out rough, strained. "I'm here," she said. "Breathe. Just breathe." The tremors in his hands slowed. The wild brightness in his eyes began, gradually, to recede, the amber settling back into something more controlled, more human. The candles along the walls steadied. The pressure that had filled the room like a held breath finally released, and Elena heard the collective exhale of an entire council that had, moments before, been braced for something none of them wanted to witness. Damien's free hand came up to cover hers, holding it against his chest, as though he needed the physical contact to fully anchor himself. "Thank you," he murmured, quiet enough that only she could hear it. When he finally straightened, composed once more, the council chamber remained silent, every gaze fixed on Elena, with an expression that had shifted, almost overnight, from suspicion into something closer to reluctant awe. "We will discuss our response to Thornwood's attack," Damien said, his voice steady once more, though his hand did not immediately release hers. "But I want it understood, by everyone in this room, that Elena Voss is under my protection. What you witnessed here today is not a weakness to be exploited. It is a truth about my stability that I expect this council to respect." No one argued. Even Marcus, standing near the back of the room with his arms crossed, said nothing, though his expression remained troubled as his eyes moved between Elena and his king. The council continued for another hour, discussing strategies and losses, and the growing certainty that war with Thornwood was no longer avoidable, but Elena barely absorbed any of it, her mind still reeling from what had just happened, from the way an entire room of powerful, dangerous people had watched her steady a king on the edge of losing himself, and had done nothing but stare in silent understanding. Afterward, once the hall had emptied, and the last of the pack leaders had departed, Damien led her to a smaller side chamber, closing the door behind them with a quiet click that felt, somehow, louder than it should have. "You shouldn't have come into that room," he said, though there was no real anger in his voice, only something that sounded closer to fear. "If my control had broken before you reached me." "But it didn't," Elena said. "I'm fine. You're fine." "You don't understand," Damien said, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Elena had not seen from him before. When an alpha loses control like that, truly loses it, the wolf does not distinguish between friend and threat. "I could have hurt you. I could have hurt anyone in that room." His eyes met hers, raw with something he had clearly been suppressing for years. That is what I have been living with since my father died. That fear. That I am one bad council meeting away from becoming a danger to everyone I am supposed to protect. Elena's chest ached at the admission, at the exhaustion carved into every line of his face. You're not that, she said firmly. You held on. You fought it, even before I got there. I have been fighting it for 3 years, Damien said. Some days I win. Some days I only barely manage to hold the line. Today, if you had not come. He stopped himself, jaw tight, unable to finish the thought. But I did come, Elena said, stepping closer, close enough now that she could see the faint tremor still lingering in his hands. And I'll keep coming, for as long as I'm here. Something in Damien's expression cracked, the careful composure he wore like a second skin, finally slipping to reveal the man beneath it, tired and frightened and desperately grateful, in a way he did not seem to know how to express. He reached up, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his touch gentle despite the strength she knew he carried. I don't know what you are to me, Elena Voss, he said quietly. The elders speak of resonance, of ancient bonds, and perhaps that explains part of it. But standing here, after everything that happened today, I find myself thinking it is simpler than that. I think I am simply grateful you exist, and terrified of what it will mean the day you decide you no longer wish to. Elena's breath caught, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the space between them charged with something neither of them had a name for, something that felt far too large and far too fragile to rush. I'm not deciding anything today, she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. No, Damien agreed, his hand still resting against her cheek. Today, I think, we have both decided enough. He did not kiss her, though Elena felt the weight of the moment when he might have. The restraint, it clearly cost him to step back instead, to give her the space he had promised from the very first night. But something had shifted between them in that council chamber, something neither of them could pretend away any longer, and as Elena returned to her own chambers that night, she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that whatever choice waited for her at the end of this strange and impossible bond, it was no longer going to be a simple one. In the days that followed, something between them shifted permanently, though neither Elena nor Damien spoke of it directly. The council chamber had changed something, stripped away pretenses neither of them could fully rebuild, and Elena found herself seeking him out in ways she would not have allowed herself before, just as she noticed him finding reasons to be near her that had nothing to do with the resonance bond the elders had described. They began sharing meals that were not required, walking the fortress gardens in the early evening, when the War Council's demands finally released him for a few precious hours. Damien showed her the training grounds where he had learned to fight as a boy, the library, where his mother had once spent hours reading to him before illness took her when he was young, the small chapel-like room where his father's memory was honored, with candles that never seemed to go out. You've lost so much, Elena said one evening, as they sat together on a stone bench overlooking the gardens, the scent of night-blooming flowers thick in the air around them. Everyone loses, Damien said simply. I have simply lost in ways that were very public, very political. My grief was never allowed to be only mine. It became the pack's grief, the kingdom's uncertainty, the moment everyone began wondering whether I was strong enough to hold what my father built. He glanced at her, something vulnerable flickering behind his usual composure. You are the first person who has asked about it, as though it were simply mine to carry, rather than something that determines the fate of an entire territory. That sounds lonely, Elena said quietly. It was, Damien admitted. It still is, most days. His hand found hers on the bench between them, not gripping, simply resting, as though testing whether she would pull away. She did not. Except when you're near. Elena's heart pounded loud enough that she wondered if his heightened senses could hear it. Damien, I still don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of this. The bond, the elders, everything Ruth said about resonance. I came here as a stranger who fell through the wrong trees on the wrong night, and now half your kingdom watches everything I do like I'm some kind of omen. I know, Damien said. I don't have easy answers for you. I only know that every day you stay, I find myself dreading, more and more, the day you might choose to leave. You promised I could, Elena reminded him, though her voice had lost the sharp edge it once carried when she said it. I did, Damien said, and I intend to keep that promise, even though it terrifies me more than facing an army from Thornwood ever could. He turned to face her fully, the candlelight from the nearby chapel room catching the sharp lines of his face, softening them into something achingly human. I am not asking you to stay forever, Elena. I am only asking you not to decide against it, before you've truly had the chance to consider what staying might mean. And what would staying mean? Elena asked softly. Damien's thumb traced slow, absent circles against the back of her hand, and when he answered, his voice had dropped low enough that it felt like a secret meant only for the two of them. It would mean a life very different from the one you left. Danger. Some of it, though I would spend every breath I have protecting you from as much of it as I could. It would mean a kingdom that is still learning to trust you, and a beta who may take considerably longer to warm to the idea than the rest of the council did. A faint smile touched his mouth. But it would also mean this. Evenings in the garden. A king who has finally remembered what it feels like to be simply a man, for a few stolen hours at a time, and perhaps, if the elders are right about the resonance deepening the longer it is nurtured, something neither of us has fully understood yet, but which I suspect, if given time, could become far more than simple peace. Elena's breath caught at the weight of what he was not quite saying, the careful restraint in his words even as everything about his expression suggested the depth of what he felt went far beyond careful. You're not asking me to stay, she said slowly. You're asking me to choose you. Deliberately. Not because some ancient bond makes it easy, but because I want to. Yes, Damien said simply. That is exactly what I am asking. The honesty of it settled over Elena like something physical, both terrifying and, to her own surprise, deeply tempting. She thought of her apartment above the bakery, of the diner shifts she used to complain about, of the ordinary life that had once felt like enough, and she thought of amber eyes gone quiet at the sound of her voice, of a king who had shown her the chapel where his grief lived, of a hand that had reached for hers, not out of desperate need, but out of simple, honest want. I'm not ready to answer that tonight, she said finally. I'm not asking you to, Damien said. I only wanted you to know the question exists. Whenever you're ready to answer it, I'll be here. They sat together beneath the stars a while longer, the silence between them comfortable now in a way it had not been on that first terrifying night. And when Damien finally walked her back to her chambers, he did not try to kiss her, though the restraint clearly cost him. Instead, he pressed a light kiss to the back of her hand, old-fashioned and careful, a promise rather than a demand. Good night, Elena Voss, he said softly. Good night, Damien, she said, and for the first time since arriving at Blackridge Fortress, she said his name without his title, and felt, in the warmth that spread through her chest at his answering smile, that some quiet, undeniable part of her had already begun to fall for a man she had never intended to meet, in a world she had never believed existed. She did not yet know how dangerous that falling was about to become. The attack came without warning, the way Ruth had told Elena the worst dangers always did. It was nearly 2 weeks after the council meeting, and Elena had grown almost comfortable within the rhythms of the fortress, learning the names of the guards who watched the eastern gate, learning which corridors caught the morning sun best, learning to recognize the particular quiet in Damien's shoulders that meant his wolf had settled simply because she had entered the room. She had begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to think of Blackridge Fortress as somewhere closer to home than she expected to. She was in the garden with Grace, discussing nothing more dangerous than the best way to braid the small white flowers that grew along the southern wall, when the alarm bells began to ring. The sound was unlike anything Elena had heard before, a deep, resonant tolling that seemed to vibrate through the stone itself, and within seconds, the fortress transformed around her, guards sprinting toward the walls, warriors shifting mid-stride, into wolves large enough to make Elena's breath catch, even after weeks of knowing such things were possible. Thornwood, Grace said, her face draining of color. They're attacking the fortress directly. They've never been bold enough to do that before. Elena. Damien's voice cut through the chaos, and he appeared at the garden entrance, already shifting into the commanding presence she had first met weeks ago, cold and sharp and utterly focused. You need to get inside, now. What's happening? Elena asked, though the fear in his eyes when he looked at her told her more than words could. Thornwood has breached the outer perimeter, Damien said. gripping her arm and pulling her toward the fortress entrance, with an urgency that made her pulse spike. This is not a border skirmish. This is a direct assault, and I have reason to believe they are not here simply to test our defenses. What do you mean? Damien's jaw tightened as they moved quickly through the corridors, guards falling into formation around them. I mean, word of you has reached beyond our borders, Elena. A human capable of steadying an Alpha King's wolf is not a secret that stays contained. Not in a world where power like that could be exploited by anyone ruthless enough to try. The implications settled over Elena like ice water. They're here for me. I won't let that happen, Damien said, his grip on her arm tightening, not painfully, but with a fierce protectiveness that left no room for doubt. They reached the inner sanctum, a fortified chamber deep within the fortress that Elena had not seen before. Thick stone walls, lined with old wards, that hummed faintly with power she could not name. Marcus was already there, barking orders to a group of guards, his expression grim. The eastern wall is holding, Marcus reported as Damien entered, but they're pushing harder than any previous engagement. Their Alpha is leading the charge himself. Victor, Damien said, the name coming out like a curse. I should have known he would grow bold enough to try something like this eventually. You know him? Elena asked. We were raised together, in a sense, Damien said grimly. Rival Alphas often are, trained by the same masters, taught the same histories, expected to eventually either ally or destroy each other. Victor chose destruction a long time ago. His eyes moved to Elena, something fierce and protective burning behind the amber. He will have heard, by now, exactly what you mean to my stability. A weapon like that, in his hands instead of mine, could unravel everything my father built to keep this territory at peace. The chamber shuddered slightly, dust drifting down from the ceiling, as something impacted the fortress walls with tremendous force. Elena's heart pounded, fear a living thing clawing up her throat, but beneath it, something steadier settled in as well, a resolve she had not expected to find in herself. Then let me help, she said. Absolutely not, Damien said immediately. You will stay here, protected, while you fight a war that's happening because of me? Elena interrupted. Damien, if my presence is the reason this attack is happening, hiding me away doesn't make me safer. It just makes me a prize waiting to be captured the moment your defenses fail. Marcus, surprisingly, was the one who spoke next. She's not wrong, Your Majesty. If Victor breaches the inner walls looking specifically for her, a locked room will only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. Damien's expression warred between fury at the danger and reluctant recognition of the truth in their words. What are you suggesting? Let her stay near you, Marcus said, his tone grudging but sincere. We both know what her presence does for your control in a crisis. If this battle stretches long enough to test your limits the way the council meeting did, having her nearby could mean the difference between victory and losing yourself entirely in front of an enemy who would exploit that weakness in a heartbeat. It was, Elena realized, the closest thing to acceptance Marcus had offered her since her arrival, and despite the danger of the moment, something in her chest eased slightly at the unexpected alliance. Damien looked torn, every protective instinct clearly screaming against the plan, but the tactical truth of Marcus's words was impossible to ignore. You stay beside me, he said finally, turning to Elena, his voice fierce with warning. Not near the front lines, not anywhere Victor's forces could reach you directly. But close enough that if my control begins to slip, you can anchor me before it becomes a liability to everyone fighting to protect this fortress. Okay, Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. I can do that. The battle that followed was unlike anything Elena had ever imagined witnessing. From the fortified position Damien led her to, overlooking the courtyard from a high balcony protected by ancient wards, she watched wolves the size of horses clash against Blackridge's defenders, watched Damien himself shift at the height of the conflict into something powerful and terrifying, and utterly magnificent, leading his warriors with a precision that spoke of years of training beneath the raw fury of battle. Twice, she felt the pull in the air that Ruth had described, the moment his control wavered dangerously close to breaking beneath the strain of the fight, and both times, Elena found herself calling his name across the chaos, watching from a distance as his massive wolf form seemed to still, just slightly, just enough, before returning to the fight with renewed focus. The battle lasted well into the night, by the time the alarm bells finally rang a different tone, one that meant retreat rather than advance, Elena's legs shook with exhaustion and fear she had been holding at bay for hours. Thornwood's forces withdrew as suddenly as they had come, Victor's own retreat visible from the balcony, a large dark wolf disappearing back into the tree line, with a final, furious howl that echoed across the fortress grounds. Damien shifted back to his human form near the base of the balcony, bloodied and exhausted but alive, and the moment his eyes found Elena watching from above, something in his expression cracked with relief, so profound it was visible even from a distance. She did not wait for permission. She ran down to him, ignoring the exhaustion in her own limbs, and when she reached him, he pulled her into an embrace fierce enough to lift her briefly off her feet, his face buried against her hair, his breathing ragged. "You're alive," he murmured against her, again and again, as though needing to confirm it with repetition. "You're alive." "So are you," Elena said, her own voice breaking slightly, as the adrenaline of the night finally began to fade, leaving only the raw fear she had been suppressing for hours. They stood together in the ruined courtyard, surrounded by the aftermath of a battle fought because of a bond neither of them had asked for, and Elena understood, with a certainty that settled deep and unshakable in her chest, that whatever choice waited for her at the end of all this, she no longer had any doubt about what her heart had already decided. She only hoped, watching the exhausted, bloodied king who held her as though she were the only steady thing left in his world, that the choice would still be hers to make when the time finally came. The days after the attack should have brought them closer. Instead, Elena watched something shift in Damien that she did not understand at first, a distance creeping into his eyes, even as his hands remained gentle whenever he touched her. A careful formality, replacing the easy warmth of their evenings in the garden. She noticed it most clearly 3 days after the battle, when she found him in the war room, hunched over maps of the Northern Territory with Marcus and several other advisors, their voices dropping the moment she entered. "What's going on?" she asked, glancing between the tense faces around the table. "Nothing that concerns you," Damien said, and the words landed like a slap, sharper than anything he had said to her since that first cold night in the throne room. "Nothing that concerns me," Elena repeated slowly. "You mean the war that started because Victor wants to use me as a weapon isn't something that concerns me?" Marcus and the other advisors exchanged uneasy glances before quietly excusing themselves, leaving Elena and Damien alone with the maps, and the tension stretching taut between them. "Elena," Damien said, his voice softer now, but no less troubled. "Victor will not stop with one attack. I know him. He will regroup, and he will come again, likely with greater numbers, likely with a strategy specifically designed around capturing you, before I can stop him. So we prepare for that," Elena said. "Together." "No," Damien said, and something in the flat finality of the word made Elena's stomach drop. "I've spent the last 3 days considering every possible way to keep you safe within these walls, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. As long as you remain at Blackridge, you remain a target. My presence, my protection. None of it changes the fundamental truth that Victor now knows exactly what you are, and exactly what capturing you would cost me." "What are you saying?" Elena asked, though some part of her had already guessed, dread pooling cold in her chest. "I'm sending you away," Damien said. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere Victor's forces cannot easily track you. Grace has agreed to accompany you to a sanctuary in the Western Territories, a place protected by wards even older than the ones here. You'll be safe there, while we deal with Thornwood." "You're making this decision without asking me," Elena said, her voice rising with a fury that surprised even her. "After everything, after promising I wasn't a prisoner here, you're just deciding what happens to me without a single word of discussion?" "I am trying to protect you," Damien said, frustration bleeding into his own voice now. "I watched you standing in that courtyard 3 nights ago, watched how close Victor's forces came to breaching the inner walls, and I cannot, I will not, risk your life on the chance that my defenses hold a second time." "That's not your decision to make alone," Elena said, her voice shaking now, though whether from anger or the ache building behind her ribs, she could not entirely tell. "You told me I could make my own choices. You told me leaving would be my decision, not yours. And now, the first time real danger comes, you're deciding for me anyway." This is different, Damien said. This is not about the resonance bond, or whether you choose to stay or go. This is about keeping you alive. It feels the same to me, Elena said, and the rawness in her own voice surprised her. It feels exactly the same. Like I'm something to be managed, instead of someone whose voice actually matters in decisions about my own life. Damien's expression cracked slightly, pain flickering behind the composed authority he had wrapped himself in since the war room conversation began. Elena, that is not what I intend. Maybe not, Elena interrupted, but it's what it feels like. You said you cared about me. Not about the bond, not about what I do for your wolf, but about me. If that's true, then talk to me like someone whose opinion matters, instead of deciding my fate in a war room while I'm not even present. For a long moment, Damien said nothing, the silence between them heavier than any battle noise had been. Elena watched something war behind his eyes, the fierce protective instinct that had driven every decision since the attack, clashing against the truth of what she was asking him to see. I am afraid, he admitted finally, quietly, the confession clearly costing him something significant. I have buried a father. I nearly lost control of my own wolf in front of an entire council, and 3 nights ago, I stood in a battle, knowing that if Victor's forces reached you before mine did, I would lose the only peace I have found in 3 years, and very possibly lose myself along with it. I am not trying to control you, Elena. I am trying to survive the possibility of losing you, and I do not know how to do that without making sure you are somewhere safe. The honesty in his voice softened Elena's anger, though it did not erase the hurt still lodged deep in her chest. I understand that fear, she said. I do. But you cannot protect me by taking away my choice. Damien, that's not protection. That's just a different kind of losing me. Something in his expression shifted, understanding dawning slowly, painfully, behind the amber of his eyes. But before he could respond, before he could take back the decision already set into motion, a guard appeared at the war room door, breathless and urgent. Your Majesty, the guard said, the escort is ready. Grace awaits Elena at the western gate, as you ordered. Elena felt something inside her go cold and still. You already sent for the escort, before you even told me. Elena, Damien started, but she was already shaking her head, stepping back from him, the hurt in her chest hardening into something sharper, something closer to the resolve that had carried her through that first terrifying night in the throne room. You made your decision, she said, her voice steady now, quiet in a way that felt more dangerous than shouting. Before you even spoke to me. That tells me everything I needed to know. That's not fair, Damien said, following her as she moved toward the door. I am trying to save your life. Maybe, Elena said, pausing at the threshold, refusing to let the ache in her chest show on her face. But you're doing it, the same way everyone else in my life has decided things for me, Damien. Without asking, without trusting that I might have a say in what happens to my own future. She left him standing in the war room, the maps of Thornwood's territory spread out behind him, and did not look back, though every step away from him felt heavier than the last, as if some invisible thread stretched taut between them, straining with every inch of distance she put between herself and the king who had, for the first time since she arrived, made her feel like something to be managed rather than someone to be loved. She did not yet know that the choice waiting for her at the western gate would test everything she had begun, quietly and against every intention, to believe about where she truly belonged. Grace waited at the western gate with 2 guards and a small carriage, her expression apologetic as Elena approached, still raw from the confrontation in the war room. I'm sorry, Grace said quietly. I didn't know this would happen so fast. I only agreed to accompany you because I thought it might make the journey easier. It's not your fault, Elena said, though her voice came out flatter than she intended. None of this is your fault. The carriage ride began in silence, the fortress shrinking behind them as they moved through the forest along a path Elena had never traveled, the trees growing denser, older, the air itself feeling different the further they went from Blackridge. She stared out the window, replaying the conversation in the war room over and over, the hurt still sharp and unresolved, despite the miles now stretching between herself and Damien. She thought of that first night, of his promise that she was not a prisoner, that her choices would remain her own. She thought of the garden, of his hand covering hers, of the honesty in his voice when he admitted how much her presence meant to him. and she thought of the guard's words at the war room door, the escort already arranged before he had said a single word to her about it, and something in her chest twisted painfully at the realization that even good intentions, even genuine fear, born from genuine care, could still feel exactly like being discarded. "He loves you," Grace said quietly, breaking the silence somewhere past the halfway point of their journey. "I've served in that fortress for 6 years, Elena. I have never seen him fight for anything, the way he fought to keep you safe these past weeks." "Fighting to keep me safe isn't the same as trusting me," Elena said. "He made a decision about my entire life without asking what I wanted. That's not love. That's fear wearing love's face." Grace considered that for a long moment. "Maybe," she said finally. "Or maybe it's simply a man who has never had anyone worth being afraid of losing, learning how to do it badly for the first time." She reached over, squeezing Elena's hand gently. "I'm not saying he was right. I'm only saying that sometimes the people who love us most make the worst decisions when they're terrified, not because they don't value our choices, but because the fear of losing us drowns out everything else, including the promises they meant to keep." Elena did not answer, staring out at the passing trees, the ache in her chest refusing to settle into anything simple enough to name. Whether Grace was right or not, the hurt remained, and beneath it, a growing certainty that had been building since the moment she stepped into that carriage. She could not stay somewhere she had been sent, rather than somewhere she had chosen. They arrived at the sanctuary as the sun began to set, a smaller fortress tucked into a valley, surrounded by mountains, warded and peaceful, in a way that should have felt like relief, after weeks of danger. Elena barely registered the beauty of it, her mind still tangled in the war room, in amber eyes that had looked, in that final moment before she walked away, more lost than she had ever seen them. That night, unable to sleep, she sat by the window of her new chambers, staring out at unfamiliar mountains, and found herself thinking not of the danger she had escaped, but of the quiet that had settled over Damien's wolf the very first time she spoke his name. She thought of Ruth's warning, that a resonance was not one-directional, that leaving might not feel as simple as walking away once had. Ruth, she realized with a slow, dawning understanding, had been right about more than she knew. Because sitting in that sanctuary, safe and protected and utterly alone, Elena did not feel relief. She felt the same ache Ruth had warned her about, a hollow space opening in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with absence, with the distance now stretching between herself and a man whose calm had somehow, without her ever intending it, become tangled up with her own. She thought of her old life, her apartment above the bakery, the ordinary rhythm of shifts at the diner, and found, to her own surprise, that none of it called to her the way it once had, that life had been safe, that life had been hers. But it had also, she was beginning to understand, been simply a life, not the life. And somewhere in the weeks since the trees had pulled her into a world she never asked for, something in her had shifted permanently, had begun measuring home, not by walls or familiar streets, but by the presence of a king, whose wolf had gone quiet the moment she spoke. She had told him leaving would be her decision. She had meant it as a boundary, a line drawn to protect her own autonomy, in a world that seemed determined to make choices for her. She had not expected that when the moment finally came, the choice would ache this much regardless of which direction she chose. Across the miles, in a fortress grown suddenly and unbearably quiet, Damien stood in the war room long after the maps had been cleared away, staring at the empty space where Elena had stood hours before, arguing with a fierceness that had reminded him, painfully, of exactly why he had fallen for her in the first place. He had told himself he was protecting her. He still believed that, even now. But Marcus's words, delivered quietly after Elena's departure, had lodged themselves deep enough that he could not shake them. "You did not send her away to protect her," Marcus had said, with the blunt honesty only a beta, who had known him since boyhood, could offer. "You sent her away to protect yourself from watching her get hurt. Those are not the same thing, Damien, and I think you know it." He had wanted to argue. He found, standing alone in the quiet war room, that he could not. Somewhere in the days since the attack, fear had made his decisions for him, the same fear that had haunted him since his father's death, the same fear that whispered every piece he found would eventually be ripped away if he did not grip it tightly enough to control every variable around it. He had promised Elena her choices would remain her own, And in the moment that mattered most, terror had made him break that promise without even realizing he was doing it. His wolf, quiet for weeks, had begun to stir restlessly again the moment her carriage disappeared beyond the gate. A low, aching pressure building beneath his skin that felt uncomfortably close to the instability he had lived with for 3 long years before she arrived. Ruth had warned him the bond was not one-directional. Standing alone in the war room, feeling the restless ache of his own wolf mourning an absence it had only just learned to fear, Damien finally understood exactly how right she had been. He had sent her away to keep her safe. He was beginning to realize, with a dread that settled cold and heavy in his chest, that he may have made the very mistake that would cost him the one thing capable of keeping either of them whole. 3 days passed at the sanctuary before Elena made her decision. 3 days of watching sunsets over unfamiliar mountains and feeling, with growing certainty, that safety without choice was not the peace she had once believed it would be. She found Grace in the sanctuary's small courtyard on the morning of the 4th day, already dressed for travel, her mind made up in a way that felt steadier than anything she had decided since arriving in this world of wolves and ancient bonds. "I need to go back," she said simply. Grace studied her for a long moment before nodding, as though she had been expecting exactly this. "I thought you might say that. The guards will not be pleased. Damien gave strict orders regarding your safety here." "Then I'll take responsibility for disobeying them," Elena said. "I'm not running from danger, Grace. I already tried that, and it didn't feel like safety. It felt like giving away the one thing I promised myself I would never give away again, the right to choose what happens to my own life." Something in Grace's expression softened into something like pride. "Then let's get you back to Blackridge." The journey back felt shorter than the one that had carried her away, or perhaps it simply felt shorter, because Elena's certainty grew with every mile. The ache in her chest, transforming gradually from grief into resolve. By the time the fortress walls came into view, dark stone rising against a sky streaked with the colors of late afternoon, her heart pounded not with fear, but with something that felt, for the first time since the war room confrontation, remarkably close to hope. She did not wait for an announcement. She walked through the gates, ignoring the startled guards who recognized her immediately, and made no move to stop her, and made her way toward the fortress, with a determination that carried her straight to the throne room doors, the same doors that had swallowed her into this world weeks ago, on a night she had been dragged in against her will. This time, she pushed them open herself. Damien stood near the hearth, exactly where she had first seen him, though the man who turned at the sound of the doors opening looked nothing like the cold, composed king from that first terrifying night. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, his shoulders carrying a tension Elena recognized immediately as the restless instability Ruth had warned them both about. "Elena," he breathed, disbelief and hope warring across his face as he crossed the room toward her. "You shouldn't be here." "It isn't safe." "I decided it was safe enough," Elena said, standing her ground as he approached. "Because I decided, Damien. Not you. Me." He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the war happening behind his amber eyes, close enough to feel the restless energy radiating off him, held back now only by sheer willpower. "I made a mistake," he said quietly, "sending you away without asking. Marcus told me the truth of it, before I was ready to hear it. And I have spent every hour since your departure, understanding exactly how badly I broke the promise I made you that first morning." "You did," Elena said, refusing to soften the truth, even as her heart ached at the raw honesty in his voice. "You let fear make a decision that should have been mine." "I know," Damien said, "and I am asking, now, properly, for the choice to be yours. Not because the bond requires it, not because the elders warned me of the cost, though I have felt that cost every single hour you were gone." His hand lifted, hesitant, giving her the space to step back if she wished. She did not. "I am asking because I love you, Elena Voss. Not the peace you bring, my wolf, though I am grateful for it every day. You, your stubbornness, your refusal to be managed, even by a king who forgot, for one terrified moment, that loving someone means trusting their choices, not making decisions for them out of fear of losing them." Elena's breath caught, the words settling over her with a weight that finally cracked open everything she had been carrying since the carriage ride to the sanctuary. "I'm not choosing you because your wolf needs me," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her resolve. I need to be clear about that. I'm not some cure to be kept close for your stability. I know, Damien said. I would never ask that of you again. I'm choosing you, Elena continued, because somewhere in the last few weeks, this fortress, this impossible world, you, all of it became more real to me than the life I left behind. Because I missed you in that sanctuary, in a way that had nothing to do with any resonance bond, and everything to do with simply missing the man who listens when I talk about traffic outside an apartment I don't think I'm going back to. Something in Damien's expression broke open entirely. Relief and love and disbelief tangled together as he closed the remaining distance between them, his hands finally, gently, cupping her face. You're staying, he said, the words caught somewhere between question and prayer. I'm staying, Elena confirmed. But not as a prisoner, not as a solution to your stability, as someone who gets a voice in every decision that affects her life from this point forward. Can you promise me that? I promise, Damien said. And this time, when he leaned down to close the last inches between them, Elena did not step back. The kiss was soft at first, careful, as though he still feared she might change her mind. But when her hands rose to grip the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, the careful restraint melted into something deeper, something that felt, at last, like two people choosing each other freely, without fear dictating the terms. When they finally broke apart, Damien rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady, his wolf, Elena could feel somehow, settling into a peace deeper than anything it had known even before. A calm, built not on instinct alone, but on a bond both of them had finally chosen with open eyes. I have one more promise to make, Damien murmured, his thumb tracing gently along her cheekbone. I will spend every day proving that choosing you was the easiest decision I have ever made, even though learning to trust your choices in return may take me a lifetime to master. I'll hold you to that, Elena said, a smile breaking through despite the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. Outside the throne room, word spread quickly through the fortress that the human woman had returned, and this time, when the pack watched her walk the halls beside their king, the suspicion that had once followed her every step had softened into something closer to acceptance, even from those, like Marcus, who had once doubted her most fiercely. Ruth, when she heard the news, simply smiled to herself by her fire, murmuring an old blessing under her breath, the kind reserved for resonance bonds rare enough to be nurtured into something far greater than the ancient texts had ever promised. No one had warned the Alpha King that the woman who calmed his wolf would also be the one to teach him what it truly meant to love, without fear. But standing in his throne room, her hand held securely in his, feeling the quiet certainty of a bond chosen freely by both hearts rather than simply granted by fate, Damien Ashford understood, at last, that some lessons were worth every ounce of fear it took to learn them. Elena Voss had come to Blackridge Fortress as a stranger dragged unwillingly through the trees. She stayed as a woman who had chosen, deliberately and completely, the king, the kingdom, and the impossible, extraordinary life that had been waiting for her all along. And in the quiet that followed, the fortress settled into a peace it had not known in 3 long years, a king finally whole, a bond finally chosen, and a love that had, against every fear and every doubt, found its way home.